All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the spring lecture series for 2022. This is our second lecture of the series. Thank you all for signing up, and for those of you at the watch party for showing up. I'm sorry I'm not there, but you should have Ellen there capably with you as well. Please don't forget, as always, there is still time to donate to our lovely cause at nmgl.org/donate. You should have closed captionings if you so need them. You just have to turn them on. As always, if you have any issues with the Zoom portion of the program, please just log off and re-log back on, whether you're missing sound or you're missing video. As always, we are recording this and we'll have it up on our YouTube video probably by Friday, if not first thing Monday morning. We're excited to have Jerry Dennis with us. He is the author of many books about natural history, outdoor recreation, and the Great Lakes, including The Living Great Lakes, which is one of the reasons we asked him to come tonight. He also has written The Windward Shore, A Place on the Water, and most recently, Up North in Michigan. He currently writes for Smithsonian, Sports Afield, Gray's Sporting Journal, and the New York Times. I'm pretty impressed with the New York Times usually. He's won numerous awards and his books have been translated upwards of 7 languages. So he's going to talk a little bit tonight about his book and his journey and the Living Great Lakes, Finding the Heart of the Inland Seas. This is, though, a very sort of interactive kind of presentation. So please feel free to ask questions at any time. Use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And I will pop in as we get questions and we can start a dialogue then with Jerry. So with that, thank you, Jerry.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Carrie. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, everyone, for logging on. The Living Great Lakes has been one of those books that really changed my life, probably more than any of my other books. And I didn't expect that. I thought it was going to be a pretty quiet book the way it left the gate. My publisher, I think, had kind of lost hope for it. They didn't really promote it, didn't think that it was going to do much. And gradually, word of mouth, I think, is what turned it into a bestseller, and then, won a bunch of awards. But just getting it published was not easy. At the time that I first discussed it with my editor at St. Martin's Press, we had developed a good relationship. We'd done 3 books already, so we would occasionally get on the phone and just chat, talk about ideas for books. And I told him that I had always wanted to write a book about the Great Lakes. The book, to me, that would tell what the lakes, show what the lakes were like. And as far as I knew, there were no books like that. None had ever been published. And I even, I had the ideas early as college, and I have notebook entries where I was writing down ideas for it that long ago. And my editor, who's a New Yorker and had never seen the Great Lakes, I'll never forget his words when I said I want to do this book. He said, not very sexy. Well, that's New York publishing code for it's not going to sell a lot of copies and not going to make the company a lot of money. So I told him a story. I had just come back from hiking to the top of Empire Bluffs, not too far from where we live. And I wrote about this briefly in the book, in the first chapter. And I had met a tourist from England who stood on the overlook at the top of the bluffs, this 300 and some feet above the lake, looked out over the lake and said, "Can one see Wisconsin from here?" And I said, "No, you can't see Wisconsin even from halfway across the lake. That's how big this lake is." Well, my editor stopped me. He said, wait, you can't see across Lake Michigan? I said, "No, you can't see across any of the Great Lakes." And he said, "Well, I didn't know that. And if I didn't know that, lots of people don't know that. Okay, we have to do this book." And that's all it took right there. So I set out to write this book that would capture the essence of the lakes. And of course, I had no idea what a big project it would be, even though I'd spent my entire life in and around and on the Great Lakes, had visited all of them, had spent a lot of time on the water. They're much vaster than I had ever imagined. I spent the first 2 years just reading everything I could about the lakes, taking notes, and periodically, like every 3 months, jumping in my car and driving. And I drove all the way around 10,000 miles of shoreline twice in the course of those first couple, 3 years. Meeting people, examining everything that struck my fancy, looking for a way to get into the subject. And that's an important point. It's not something that you can always just turn on. You have to find a point of entry that will get you inside the subject. And then you have to be able to stay there for a good, long, sustained period while you write the book. Nothing seemed to be working. I found myself writing a series of essays about the Great Lakes, and some of those essays ended up in the book. But I knew I needed a driving force. I needed a narrative that would carry all the story, the whole story, which includes, a lot of description of the history of the lakes and the environmental story, and the natural history of what's going on beneath the surface. All of that. I didn't want it to ever be dry, so I wanted a story to be able to tell that through a story. And I had some crazy luck. One of the first was on the anniversary. I think it was the 23rd anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which would have been November 10th, 1975. That the year I'm talking about was 1998. 23 years later, I woke up that morning, the anniversary of the sinking, and there was a storm blowing, and there were 80-mile-an-hour winds howling. And I just impulsively jumped in my car and drove to the Upper Peninsula and out to the tip of Whitefish Point, figuring that was the nearest point of land to where the Fitzgerald sank. If I could stand on the shore and look out at the storm-tossed waters of Lake Superior, I might get some kind of idea of what it was like on the lake that day in 1975. And it was insane. The wind was just unbelievable. It was blowing at nearly the velocity of the storm in 1975 from the wrong direction, but that didn't matter. It was just blowing incredible waves. And I met a guy, and he was there taking photos or filming the waves. And he said, "Are you here for the reunion?" And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And he said, "I work at the Shipwreck Museum here at the Point, and today is the anniversary of the Fitzgerald, and the families of the men who were lost on the ship that day have a reunion every year and talk about what happened, and why don't you come?" I was invited. It's usually only family members, but they allowed me to come and sit quietly in the back and hear these amazing stories. The most amazing of all was when the tribal chief of the area of Bay Mills Indian Reservation, a guy named John Lufkin, got up and told the story of his experience on Lake Superior the day that the Fitzgerald went down. He and his cousin were caught in that storm in a 16-foot open boat, and of course almost died. They barely made it through. So I wrote about this at length in the book. This was just an incredible stroke of luck for me to be able to hear that story and to share it in the book. But it still wasn't enough. It wasn't that those kinds of things were happening. I was getting a lot of good individual stories, but I still needed a driving force. And I thought, of course, well, I should tell the story from the decks of boats. And so I had started doing that already. I talked my way onto a sailboat and raced in the Chicago to Mackinac race, which was a great adventure and great fun. And I got the most seasick of my life. And other boats, I went out on research vessels. I went out on fishing boats. And again, it just wasn't what I was looking for. It didn't have that sustained narrative that I needed from the beginning of the book to the end. And then I had another stroke of luck. I saw in our local newspaper here in Traverse City, Michigan, the Malabar, a two-masted schooner that had been doing evening cruises and wedding receptions and school ship duty for probably 10 years in Grand Traverse Bay. had sold. A guy in Maine had bought her, and he had hired a crew or a captain and a first mate, and they were going to sail her to Bar Harbor, Maine. And I thought, wow. So I called this guy, found his number, gave him a call, asked him if he thought it'd be okay if I came along on the trip and volunteered as a deckhand. And he said, it's up to the captain. He's in Traverse City now working on the boat. His name is Hayo Nuttall. Go down to the marina and ask him. If it's okay with him, it's okay with me. So I went, and I committed the landlubber's error of stepping on the deck without being invited and yelling down the companionway, hello, anybody home? And this mutton chop guy jumps out of his head out of a porthole, and he says, who the hell are you? What are you doing on my boat? So I scrambled, told him a little about it, and he listened as I was talking, and he says, I love books. And he went back down below deck, came up with an armload of books to prove to me that he liked books. Well, we hit it off, and I was officially a member of the crew. He and the first mate, Matt Otto, had been there for a month or so, if I remember right, working to repair some damage to the hull. The Malabar, it was a ferro cement vessel, which I knew nothing about, but her hull was actually made out of concrete, layered over a steel mesh framework. And it was a style of boat making that had been popular in like the 1970s, and there were a few of them around, but not a lot of them. And she had rotted. Some of that steel mesh under the concrete had gotten moisture in it and had rusted away, and then the concrete started to crumble. So Matt and Hayo he said, Hayo told me when he first got to her, he could punch his fist through the hull in a couple spots. It was that badly decayed. So he and Matt were tearing out the bad concrete and repairing it and replacing it with a new tougher material. And they were almost done. So we set off, and that journey, which took exactly 1 lunar month, from Traverse City, Michigan to Bar Harbor, Maine, became the narrative vehicle for me to tell the story of the Great Lakes. My only regret, and Hayo's as well, was that we couldn't take it up to Lake Superior, but I had done other trips on Lake Superior that I used to supplement the story in the book. So that's it in a nutshell. We had lots of adventures, as those of you who've read the book know. Saw some storms that I hope will never see again, anything like that. Had all kinds of human adventures with the crew. The crew kind of varied. It was usually five people, always men in this case. And we mostly got along, but 2 of the guys on the crew really didn't like each other. It was a chemistry issue. They squared off from the first day, and they never quit arguing and pushing each other. And I wrote a little about that. I decided in the end that it really wasn't enough of the story of this book to include, although I kind of regret it because I have received a lot of letters from readers saying what a kick they got out of that. But it was an amazing journey, and I forged a lifetime friendship with Hayo, and I'm still in contact with him, and have never looked back and never regretted it. I suddenly found myself in the very strange position of being a spokesman for the Great Lakes, which is something I never anticipated. I did a quick count, and since the book came out 19 years ago, I guess, I've been invited to give keynote addresses at conferences and symposia and at universities all through the Great Lakes region, from Minnesota to New York to upstate New York, more than 200 times. And to the point where it became essentially my job, which I had never planned on. And that was at the point, Carrie, where I kind of quit writing for periodicals. I had done it I'd made my living primarily from writing for those magazines that you mentioned, plus others, and was a little tired of deadlines and of the limits of magazine writing, length, and newspaper writing. The length is part of it. They need to be, pretty short. And also the editors always had preconceived ideas of how they wanted the story to be. And I was looking for more elbow room than that. So starting in about 2003, when the book came out, I replaced magazine writing with public speaking, and then focused my attention on writing the books, my own books, the way I wanted to write them, as I always had. And I'm still doing it. That's what I'm doing to this day.
So I'll be honest, I have a couple of my own personal comments right off the bat, which is your story about the guy from New York multiple people not realizing you can't see across the lake. My best friend who lived in California and then Texas showed up. We got off the plane in Cleveland. I took her to the lakefront and she said, "Well, where's Canada?" I'm like, "What do you mean, where's Canada?" So it's always interesting when people who aren't from the Great Lakes, their misconceptions about where we are and what we are. My other sort of comment was, you mentioned about the cement boat, which I think is fascinating. And because you went to Bar Harbor, I had a friend who did his master's thesis on a cement boat that sank somewhere off the Maine coast. So,
Oh, really?
yeah, it's kind of interesting. I do find it always interesting, though, when you look at a boat that's in poor shape, like to the point that you can put a fist through it, how well do you know and trust these guys that their repairs are good enough to get you where you need to go?
Believe me, that was on my mind a lot. Every time the waves got a bigger than a few feet, and especially in the storms, the storm in Long Island Sound, which was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And even the locals, when we talked to local sailors later, none of them had ever seen a storm like that on the Sound. 12-foot waves and incredible barrages of thunder. And I was at the helm, and I could see every flash of lightning. It was almost continuous lightning flashes. I could see the boat 100 feet ahead of me flexing like this under the wave as the waves washed under it and over it, flexing just exactly the way you would flex a piece of concrete if you wanted to break it. And I was just thinking, we're going to crumble, it's going to fall apart, we're going to sink like a rock. And I couldn't help thinking, as I had already many times, how good of a job did Matt and Otto do. And we were well along on our journey when Matt admitted that Hayo admitted that he and Matt had never checked beneath the water line. So
okay, I can't be the only one whose eyes are getting really big right here. Unfortunately, you can't see everybody else who's online. Holy cow.
It seemed like a pretty important thing to me, but they didn't seem to be very concerned. They said something about the water will prevent it from just decaying, which I don't know. I trusted those guys. And as a matter of fact, when we got to Bar Harbor and boat was raised from the water and inspected for Coast Guard licensing, the hull beneath the waterline was in great shape. They tunked every inch of it, and every tunk was solid and made a nice resounding tunk. So we didn't have to worry about that, but there was plenty of other things to worry about.
How long had the boat been in Traverse City, and had you been on it? But I mean, since you're from that area, had you been on it before, just as a tourist or anything?
I had. In fact, one of my first magazine assignments or newspaper assignments was for the Detroit News. I don't remember what year. It would have been in the late 80s, probably 1980s. And the Malabar was new at that point and was just doing its cruises. And I pitched the idea to my editor at the newspaper of doing a story about this new phenomenon in Traverse City of a schooner being used for evening cruises and wedding reception stuff. So I wrote about her then. And so it was 15 years later that I'm on her again. But by then she'd been treated pretty badly. We had been watching her the previous winter, she was listing at anchor, and we knew she was taking on water, and it was hard to see. So everybody was really glad to see that she had been sold to somebody who was willing to put some money into it and keep her in operation. But it hasn't ended. The story hasn't ended happily. The Malabar, she reverted back to, new owners reverted her back to her original name, which was the Rachel and Ebenezer. And she ended up in the Keys and sustained some real serious hurricane damage, and then was basically abandoned. I found a photo taken a year ago, and she was up on a mud flat, half underwater, and tilted over on a channel leading into Key Largo. And to me, it looks like there's no salvaging her, but who knows?
Bummer. So one of our members that's listening wants to know, where did you get the courage enough to take on the Great Lakes? I mean, like you said, you started reading, you knew about the storm at the Emma Fitzgerald took, you went out and saw that storm. What makes you say, yeah, I'm going to get on a boat and sail across it just to see for the heck of it? I mean, that does take a lot of courage.
A lot of it was just not, stupidity. I didn't know what I was getting into. A lot of it, I had no idea what it was going to be like sailing the length of Lake Michigan in the Chicago to Mackinac race in a pretty small sailboat, and getting so seasick that I wanted to die. That's the old joke, is you're afraid you're going to die, and then you're afraid you won't die. So a lot of it was, I didn't really know what I was getting into. I didn't know how battered it would feel to be on the lake in those storms, even though I had grown up on it and had been out on some pretty rough water. And I wrote about in the book about the Coho storm of 1967 in Platte Bay, where 7 anglers died, and of being 12 years old and watching 2 of those men drown, and trying to help with my father and my uncles, trying to help save lives. So I had a healthy respect for the lakes, no doubt about it.
Okay. So I had somebody ask, okay, once you got off the lakes, and I know you guys took the Erie Canal, is there a reason you took the canal versus the St. Lawrence Seaway?
Yeah, we found out we're planning on taking the St. Lawrence route, but en route we learned that there were icebergs clogging the mouth. So this was in May, and they were still a hazard. And if you look at a map, it's a long ways north. That was a lot farther miles wise, but it would have been less effort than having to step the masts and go through everything we had to go through on the canal. But I'm glad we went that route, because it was fascinating. The Erie Canal was really worth seeing, and I learned a lot about it as we proceeded.
Let's see, Jeffrey Cox wants to know, is there one special characteristic you like about each of the lakes? And so I'm assuming, can you talk about them as 5 different entities, and what makes each one spectacular?
Well, they're very definitely 5 entities. Lake Michigan and Lake Huron are technically one lake. They're at the same level, but they're different. They have a very different feel. Lake Huron is the least populated. It's the only one of the Great Lakes that doesn't have a metropolis on it. And if you can call Duluth a metropolis, but it doesn't have a big city on it. And it's north and eastern shores. The Canadian side is very rugged. The rock formations there are practically rival Lake Superior's. There's wonderful places to explore along those shorelines. The west shore, the Michigan shoreline, is stones and rocks. There's very few sand beaches, because the prevailing winds are what create the sand. And the west shore of Michigan, east shore of Lake Michigan, that constant battering of the waves has created sands and sand dunes. So you get a real different feel. A lot of it also has to do with the vegetation on the land around the lakes. I would say Lake Huron is predominantly conifers, and Lake Michigan is probably predominantly deciduous trees, and they give a different color to the water. Lake Superior's got a lot of conifers. It's got that black spruce biome across the whole North Shore that is wonderful and unique and rugged. Lake Erie has a lot of agriculture and marshlands, and those marshes were something that were new to me and fascinating. The Black Swamp, you know, and the history of that. And Lake Ontario is a little more like Lake Michigan with some sand beaches, not really dunes, a few small dunes, and it has, you know, it has its own flavor as well, you know. So yeah, each one is different.
It is. I agree. I've now been fortunate enough to, I haven't been, as within my job, I have not been diving in each lake, but I have been to each lake, and they all seem to have something different. An anonymous person wants to know, there seems to be a rich tradition of folklore and legends on the Great Lakes. Did you hear any odd stories while you were working on this project? And, you know, whether it's the Mackinac race or the time on the Malabar or whatever other boats you were on, from some of these probably sailors that have been around forever.
Yeah, I heard a lot of stories, and you know, some of them would fall into the category of myths and legends. Some of them were just tall tales, and some were just those great, you know, stories you can spin out when you've got a lot of time on your hands and you're on the deck of a boat. A lot of adventure stories. The sailors, you know, the professional sailors, the crews of the ore carriers, for instance, there's no romance to the lakes for those people. It's a day in, day out job. In fact, they get a little testy if they sense that you're looking for stories that tell the romance of the lakes and of the legends. To them, they're kind of like highways, or they give that impression, but invariably the ones I talk to, at some point, they would light up and start talking about amazing storms that they had been through, or amazing moments on the water, often at night when the stars are incredibly bright, because you're out of sight of land. You don't have light pollution, and those stars are reflecting on calm water, so that the stars around you are just as bright as the ones above you, and it feels like you're floating in space. Those kinds of stories were told a lot. There were funny things. I wrote in a subsequent book, The Windward Shore, a winter on the Great Lakes. I told about a fake website that was put up offering cruises to do whale and dolphin watching on Lake Michigan, just outside of Chicago. And of course, you know, those of us who live here know it was a gag, but it was very convincing, and it showed it had a really great photo of a right whale broaching half out of the water with the Chicago skyline in the background. Well, a magazine published in New Mexico for school children caught wind of that website and did a cover story about whale watching on the Great Lakes, and went into great detail about it. And it took an elementary school teacher to call them up and say, "No, you guys, you've been hoodwinked. This is not real."
Again, I think that's one of those that goes back to what we were initially talking about, how little people know about it. I think sometimes I didn't realize the scale and size that they have, and the effects that the Great Lakes have on the country, and and we talk about this a lot within our museum, the effects that it has on not just the United States, but the whole North American continent, how much it has an effect on its history, how much it has an effect on its daily weather and environment and those kinds of things. And it's always just sort of, how are we missing that in our education to some extent, unless you're from here? And that's not really a question. It's just sort of a whatever. I have, I'm going to take two questions and kind of put them into one. Robert wants to know, basically, what is your environmental assessment of the Great Lakes today? And along with that, Kenneth is asking, you know, how the lakes changed from the time you wrote the book. And I kind of thought those two kind of went together.
Yeah, absolutely. That's been on my mind a lot. I'm in conversations with my publisher about bringing out a 20th anniversary edition next year. And if we get the approval to do it, I'll be writing a new chapter or a long introduction where I bring that kind of bring up to date information, especially about environmental concerns and climate change. Now, I've hardly touched on climate change in 2003. I mentioned it, and I talked a little about it, and I've been aware of it and been following it for more than a decade and had written about it, but not in relation to the Great Lakes. We're seeing now some very alarming things, as probably everyone who's watching knows. Last summer, algae blooms on Lake Superior in places where there had never been an algae bloom in living history. And water is all water temperature. There's a very fine book called Sustaining Lake Superior by Nancy Langston. She's a researcher up at Michigan Tech University and is studying the effects of climate change on Lake Superior. And she concluded that Lake Superior is the fastest warming large body of fresh water in the world. And she predicts some dire changes. The Lake Superior has been immune from a lot of the invasive species like zebra and quagga mussels because of the cold water, and spiny water flea and round goby. They're showing up now, and it's starting in the bays as it did in the other Great Lakes, and it's just a matter of time before they spread throughout the lake and affect the ecosystem. So we're all very aware of that. The invasion of further invasive species since that book are there as well. I wrote it before the Asian carp threat, and that's something that a lot of people are watching really carefully. And basically, I had a biologist in Ohio tell me, or in Chicago tell me that the only thing keeping the Asian carp out of Lake Michigan and the rest of the Great Lakes is that the Chicago, the waterway below between the Chicago River and the Illinois River is so polluted they can't live in it. So there's an electric barrier too, and that's helping. But that polluted water is in his opinion, was the number one factor. So I'm doing some more research and trying to keep up on and catch up on all these changes.
Okay. So I did hear you talk about professional sailors. Did you have any opportunities to get on whether a freighter or a tug, like a working vessel versus, I'm not trying to downplay the sailing vessels because they're amazing and they serve their own purpose, but did you, within all of this, have any chance to be on a working vessel?
No, in the end, I decided not to because it had been done so many times by magazine and newspaper writers. But I did meet the engineer on a freighter, a vessel that hauled liquid products, petroleum-based products. He's in the book. He ended up riding along with us from Oswego, New York to Bar Harbor. He was great company. It turned out to be a really good addition to the crew. And he gave us all tours of his vessel and talked about what it's like to be on it for months and stuff. So that's as close as I came.
No, sorry, I just thought. Again, I have another two questions that may kind of go together, which is talking a little bit about some of the extension on the Great Lakes. John is asking about what your thoughts are on Lake St. Clair. Some of this is, this is not one of the Great Lakes, but an extension of the Great Lake. And then Laurel is saying, would you consider Georgian Bay the sixth Great Lake? And we won't even get into the debacle that was Lake Champlain at one point, but it's, yeah.
Well, yeah, Georgian Bay could have easily been declared its own Great Lake. It's that big. Lake St. Clair is big too, but is it a Great Lake? I don't know. I guess I would vote probably not. But it's fascinating in itself, and the St. Clair River and the Detroit River, St. Clair flowing into it and the Detroit River flowing out of it are fascinating as well. So I don't take a real strong stance on it, but I'm pretty content with 5 Great Lakes.
I'm not going to disagree. I will say, on a shipwreck side of things, coming out of Lake Erie, whenever I talk about shipwrecks and the number of shipwrecks in Lake Erie, I always include Detroit River, Lake St. Clair, and the St. Clair River, because I do think those connecting waterways sometimes get forgotten. We just talk about these individual bodies, but they are all connected, and those connecting waterways are very important as well.
Absolutely. A friend of mine, Lynn Heasley, has a new book out that's wonderful called The Accidental Reef. It's about the St. Clair River. And she found so many great stories on that river. And under it, she became acquainted with scuba divers who do this really treacherous diving in those currents. Have you dived in the St. Clair?
I have not. I'm not big on currents. I'm also not big on being that close to a travel lane with very large boats. So I try to stay away from those things.
They talked about pinning themselves to the bottom, grabbing a rock while the hull of a vessel is passing 20 feet over their head. 20 feet's not very far, and it's got a big screw turning.
Yeah, it does.
I know. It's pretty hair raising. But you dive on wrecks?
I do. I try to sometimes.
Have you spent any time at Long Point on Lake Erie? On the
I
Canadian
have
side?
not. Sorry, I'm getting another question in real quick. I have not spent enough time on the Canadian side of things. Long Point is definitely on my go-to list someday. There's so much just here in Ohio to be done that I kind of trying to just focus on this area at this point. So hold on, so our watch party, their microphone didn't work, so they're now texting me. The watch party's texting me their questions. Somebody in the room wants to just talk a little bit more about your driving trips. You said you did 2, of the 10,000 miles around in 3 years. Did you do them in different seasons? Did you pick up different, were you looking for different things during the 2 trips? Like what made you go twice, first of all? And just, can you talk a little more about anything about it? Because I think it would be fun to do. That's another on my personal bucket list to do.
Well, yeah, it's a great trip. I've crossed the north shore of Lake Superior many times on the Trans-Canada Highway. And that was sort of what excited my interest initially, because I had remembered so many good trips up there. I thought, well, I'll see what the rest of it's like as well. And I ended up doing it twice, because after I'd done the first one, then I thought of things I should have seen. And I also found people I wanted to interview in person on, in their home turf. So I ended up just going ahead and doing another one. And that second one was a lot more work oriented. I knew right where I was going, and for the most part. First one, I just let whim lead me, and I got off the main highway as much as I could, just poked around. Much of that was with my wife, and we would just explore little villages and set up camp sometimes, grab motel rooms other times, and work our way along through the lakes, which is really, really great entertainment. And I did some winter driving, but it was primarily during the warm weather months.
That was going to be my next question, is is this summer or winter? Have you, how long does a full trip all the way around take? Taking your time, exploring, that kind of stuff.
Well, you need to plan on several weeks.
Oh yeah, I was thinking.
I don't remember how, yeah. I don't know. I've never tallied it up exactly how long it took us, but yeah, you plan on lots of time.
Excellent.
And when you're up in on the North Shore of Superior, take a sleeping bag with you and some food, and some spare gas, maybe even, because there are some of these towns are really small, and the businesses come and go really fast up there because it's so hard to make a living. So you might suddenly find yourself 150 miles from the nearest gas station, and you're running low and have to turn around and go back to the last town. I've done that a few times.
Whoops. Okay. Here's an interesting question from Don. And again, this is a little bit maybe asking some procedural, not procedural is not the right word, but you'll get it anyway. what kind of protections are in place to prevent water from the Great Lakes being diverted to other parts of the country where water will be needed to sustain population centers in the future?
Well, that's a great question. Dave Dempsey has a new edition of his great book on that subject called Great Lakes for Sale that just came out. By law, the water is protected by the Great Lakes Compact. It basically says that nobody can withdraw water from any of the Great Lakes without the approval of all the states and provinces that are bordering it. But there apparently are some loopholes. There's an organization called FLOW, that's an acronym for Love of Water, that was founded by environmental attorney Jim Olson, who's the guy who has led the fight against Nestle here in Michigan about taking groundwater and bottling it and selling it. He, excuse me, he makes a very good argument that the groundwater is the sixth Great Lake, to refer back to a previous question, and that because it's all connected, and that you can't take, according to the Great Lakes Compact, you shouldn't be able to take groundwater out either. It's a constant battle. There's so many good arguments both ways. You know, there's a couple communities in Wisconsin that are just outside of the watershed. They're on the lake, the Mississippi River side, and near Milwaukee, and they're out of water. They're running out of water. They've had to drive their municipal wells deeper and deeper and deeper till they're 600 feet deep, and they're running into natural, arsenic and serious problems like that. So all they want to do is pipe the water 20 miles, and they have a good argument. But do we want to set that precedent?
Right. It's once it's 20 miles, then it's 40 miles, then it's 300 miles, then it's Las Vegas. Or whatever it could be. No, I understand that. So I'm going to ask a question here that you and I can follow up on later. You've mentioned a number of books tonight, and I had actually written down, that the fact that you started reading voraciously to begin writing this book, and you obviously as a writer, you're a voracious reader. Do you have any good really recommendations? And that maybe, after we have this talk, maybe tomorrow or the next day, we can email and you could give me a list of 5 books so that I could then send out to everybody in case they don't have time to write it all down real quick.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll just talk about one that really got a lot of attention, and rightfully so. It's a terrific
just
book.
Mentioned that in the comments. So yeah, The Life and Death of the Great Lakes is really something.
That's by far the best environmental history of the lakes. And Dan Egan is a really good journalist and a tireless researcher. So I highly recommend that. But I'll email a list to you.
Okay, that would be, again, like I said, you've done so much reading on this topic. You're going to know where as opposed to picking up something that's just a slog to get through, or maybe this, for whatever, you would have a much better idea.
You're kind of frozen on me, Carrie.
Oh, I'm sorry. Uh-oh. Hold on. Am I back?
You are now. Yep,
okay.
You were frozen for me.
I apologize for that. We do have a thunderstorm coming through my hometown right now, so I'm happy I hope everything stays okay. Laurel is asking, outside of this nonfiction stuff, do you have any good novels or mysteries that take place on the Great Lakes that you particularly enjoy?
Oh boy. I know there are some. None jump out at me. There was one, this a classic called Castle Nowhere. I believe it was set on Mackinac Island, and it was published, I want to say in the 1930s. And it's been a long time since I read it, but I know it. I remember it being really compelling. But I'll have to add that to the email list.
Okay, that would be great. This is one of those sort of my own personal aside. I get the pleasure of making my own personal asides. I'm the one talking to you. It's funny that you say something, Castle Nowhere from maybe the 30s and 40s, and I tie that into the concept of the fact that the Great Lakes were more known and used as a vacation spot. I think a lot because of the passenger steamers and such. And so I think, writing about that, if somebody goes to their publisher in New York and says, oh, I'm gonna write about, Traverse City, a mystery there, and they're gonna be like, nobody knows where that is, and why would we publish it? Whereas I think in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, it was a little more well known.
Yeah, I think you're right. And there were some books, general interest books written in that era as well, probably for that very reason.
Right. And again, possibly even in conjunction with some of the what am I trying to say? The cruise lines, probably drumming up business for themselves.
Sure. Yeah, they may have been paying the authors under the table.
Yeah, very, very well, may have. So I will say the one question I've kind of been holding a little towards as we sort of headed towards the end, that so as I mentioned, this was part of our Great Lakes book club, this was our first year for it, and the book club loved this book and they were fascinated by it. The one question they came away with that they really wanted to get you to answer, if possible: do you feel like you found the heart of the inland seas?
I caught glimpses of it. I think I found it. But I'm not sure that it's accurate to say there's just one heart to it. But boy, the feel of the Great Lakes, there's no place in the world that I've seen that's anything like it. And there is a definite essence to this place, or a sense of place, which is that authors like to talk about. So yeah, I'd say I did, but I say it in all humility, because it is such a big, complex subject.
That's awesome. I'm not wrapping up, but I am a little. I want to let everybody know. I mean, I know a lot of you pre-purchased the Living Great Lakes, and we've sent that out to you. If you are still interested, we still have them for sale on our store website, so please take a look at that. I did also, again, this came out of the book club, was just a little, if you wanted to talk a little bit more about the newest book, Up North in Michigan.
Yeah.
Just because they, I think somebody in the club had heard about it and was interested based upon reading Living Great Lakes as well.
Well, yep, I've lived most of my life up in the Traverse City area, and a couple years in the Marquette area, and have always written about it. I've always been as fascinated about this place as I am about the Great Lakes in the larger sense, and found myself writing, especially when I was writing for magazines, a lot of profiles of the place and of people, and knew at some point I would have to make a book out of it. So this is it, and just came out last fall. They're essays. It's a collection of essays.
And I will brag for you, it's been named one of the, hold on, I wrote it down somewhere, by the Library of Michigan, one of 2022's notable books. So
Yes.
I think that's pretty high. I mean, again, we've all really enjoyed Living Great Lakes. It makes me want to go out and definitely start reading some more.
Thank you.
So we're headed towards the end here, I think. Do you have any, let me see, hold on, I got a bunch coming in. Oh, these are all about okay, I have a question here from Donna saying, I always think about Jerry Dennis and Glenn Wolfe together. Can you talk about their amazing work together? My house is filled with their art and prose.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Glenn's art has made my books much better, and I'm really lucky to have him as a friend and collaborator. He grew up in Traverse City, as I did, and we went to high school together, but we didn't know each other. We were a year apart, and it was only later that we got together. And by then we knew about each other's work. We were writing, he was illustrating publications that I was writing for, magazines, in New York-based magazines, because he was living in New York for many years, getting established as an illustrator. Then he came back to Traverse City, and we sat down and just went to town. First time we met, had lunch, and we roughed out our first book together, just sitting there, first time we'd ever met. And it's been like that ever since. We just inspire each other, and we understand each other really well. It's uncanny how much alike our thinking is. You know, many times, countless times, I'll be writing something, and you know, I have told him, let's think about doing a book about, well, our first book together was Wonders of the Sky. It's called It's Raining Frogs and Fishes. And I said, maybe a chapter about, you know, falling stars. And so I'd start writing some notes, and I'd think, oh, yeah, I want to talk about what an impact that has on kids, how magical it is for kids. And this was back in the days of faxes. He faxed me a sketch and showed his kids out in the yard watching falling stars, you know, and we're just always on the same wavelength like that. And Gunn's also a really fine artist. His fine art has been exhibited all over, and you know, is represented by some really nice galleries. So.
Excellent. Well, that's good to have somebody to work with, especially if, you know, when you're doing things like that. It's good to have somebody to bounce ideas off with, and especially if you enjoy them, that's even better.
Oh, yeah.
I've got, I think, kind of two more quick questions. One coming out of the watch party. Do you know, are there any, you know, young explorers doing now what you did 20, 25 years ago?
Not exactly. I've been, you know, I'm in contact now and then with young people who are doing really interesting things like surfing on the Great Lakes. There's I guess it's probably been 10 years now, a documentary called Unsalted, I believe. And it's about surfing in the Great Lakes. And that filmmaker is really dynamic and inventive and fearless. My oldest son is also a filmmaker, and he's done some really good work on the Great Lakes. And I've met people who have canoed and kayaked around the lakes. Who, Lorene, what's her name? Lorene. Shoot. Oh, I'm embarrassed not to remember her name. Lorene. Anyway, she's walked around several of the Great Lakes and written wonderful books. A 1,000-mile walk around Lake Michigan was her first book. Lorene Neuenhaus.
Okay. Oh, yes.
Yeah, and she's a really good writer. And you know, I've met her and talked about adventures. There are young artists who are doing remarkable things, looking at the lakes in new ways. Young men and young women who are seeing the lakes from a completely different perspective than traditional artists did, and you know, are discarding any of those cliched images of, you know, breaking waves and sunsets, and doing crazy, interesting things. I wrote an introduction for a book on Lake Huron. It's just a photo book of Lake Huron. Every image is taken from the same spot on the shore, looking at the lake with a horizon line right across the middle, which, you know, every photography art class teacher said, never do that. You always have to off center it to make it more interesting to the eye. She proved that myth wrong, because these images are stunning. She did through a whole year of seasons. So there's some people doing some really good things. And of course, the environmental battles, we're really working hard on those. A lot of people are.
Okay. Oh, Ellen is mentioning that we actually had Lorraine as a speaker a number of years ago.
Oh, good.
I knew I recognized the name from somewhere. And I just wanted to say, you know, not only are people doing new and interesting things, but I know, and it's been a number of years since we've had them, but there's also people taking the historic way. And it's probably been 10 years, but there was a college group that built a canoe and rode it all the way across, but lived like they were in the 1700s. I mean, they packaged, I mean, I think not food necessarily, but they slept outside, they tented for themselves, like, and it was really fascinating. And I'm sure something came out of it. I hate to admit that I didn't follow up with it, but I think there's lots of interesting things going on out there in ways people are experiencing the Great Lakes.
Absolutely.
the last I think I have here is Matt is wondering, where can we find some of your older writings that you did for magazines and newspapers?
Oh,
Anywhere, everywhere?
some of it's online. Some of it's been collected in my various books of essays, like From a Wooden Canoe and The River Home and A Place on the Water. And the new one up north of Michigan, and this one as well, which I haven't mentioned much. Well, I did mention it, The Windward
Yeah.
Shore, Winter on the Great Lakes. One of the things that, I liked about magazine writing is that I could take those pieces and eventually make them the way I wanted right off from the beginning and put them in a book. But a lot of those magazine pieces are online.
Okay. Well, and again, I'll do this for you. You do have a lovely website. If I remember, jerrydennis.net.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can find a lot of your books that you've published, including the books that you've published with Glenn Wolfe there, and find out more information about them. So I will also share that website again when I send out the YouTube link and the list of books that Jerry's going to put us together. So we're kind of headed to the end. Jerry, this has been phenomenal. Thank you. This has been a very different program for us, but really fascinating. I would like to try and do things like this again, and I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. For those of you still hanging on there, and as I still hanging on, we had over 100 people on tonight, Jerry. Our next lecture series will be the last one for the year on April 6th. We will have someone from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to talk about the history of the Army Corps of Engineers around the Great Lakes. And they did a little bit of everything from the building and maintenance of the Sioux locks to dredging. They are involved in a lot, with a lot. If you aren't currently members, don't forget you can always become a member at nmgl.org/membership. And with that, I thank all of you for being here tonight, spending this time with us and listening to me and Jerry chat anyway. But thank you for all of the great questions. It's been really a lot of fun. And we will see you all again, hopefully in 2 weeks. And Jerry, thank you again 1,000 times. This was really wonderful.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
All right, everybody, have a great night. See you later.